My God, she just spoke the language of his late wife. In a crowded cafe in Seattle, the young woman bent down to comfort her crying little brother with a few whispered phrases in a strange tongue that no one else around understood. But in the corner of the room, a man froze, his hand trembling as he dropped his coffee cup. Those syllables, uncannily exact, were the secret language he and his deceased wife had used only with each other. No one else in the world knows it. So how does she? And if those old words have truly returned, is he encountering a ghost, or is he reconnecting with a piece of his own soul he thought he'd lost? That afternoon, Seattle seemed drowned in shades of gray. The rain fell ceaselessly, draping a thin veil of melancholy over every window pane of emberlight. A small cafe nestled by the Lake Union docks, where the aroma of espresso mingled with soft jazz notes, like a wordless poem. Hazel Quinn stood behind the counter, her hands moving as if pre-programmed efficient yet imbued with gentleness. She brewed coffee as though composing a symphony, attending to every tiny detail as if the world around her were whispering secrets only she could understand. But no one knew that behind those calm eyes and breeze-light footsteps was a 25-year-old woman who had lost too much. Her parents died in a car accident one winter night when she was struggling through her sophomore finals. Hazel didn't cry at the funeral. There was no time. She signed the guardianship papers like a true adult, took in Leo, her 7-year-old brother, and vowed he would never spend a night in foster care. From then on, Hazel's life became a fragile balancing act of scholarships, shift work, and budget meals. By day, she was an ancient linguistics student at the University of Washington, seeking warmth in forgotten letters. By night, she was both sister and mother, wiping Leo's tears while studying alphabets lost thousands of years ago. And then came days like today when theory gave way to startling reality. Leo stood at the edge of the counter, clutching a worn wooden bracelet, the only keepsake from their mother. Hazel was pouring milk into a latte when she heard her brother's sudden alarm. In one accidental jolt, the string snapped. The wooden beads scattered across the floor, light and soft as sighs. Leo let out a cry. His sob was not loud, but its chill cut through the cafe like a gust of wind straight to the heart. Customers looked up, some frowning, some moved with sympathy. Hazel dashed over, forgetting everything in her hands. She knelt beside him, grasped his shoulders, his eyes red, breath ragged, as though he'd lost his entire world. Without thought, without intention, without calculation, Hazel's voice emerged soft, low, yet tearing through the tense hush of wooden chairs. Jelinet Milla, Elena Nori. A strange stream of words slipped from her lips. Hazel had never studied them in any class, yet she remembered her mother whispering them on stormy nights when Hazel ran fevers and dreamed dark dreams. Her mother called it Eliran, the language for souls not yet ready to say goodbye. Leo blinked. His panic eased with each syllable. Though he didn't know the meaning, his little heart recognized the comfort. He leaned into his sister's shoulder, his breathing evened out, and Hazel trembled as if she had just unlocked a long-sealed door in her memory. At that moment, in the far corner of the cafe, a soft crash echoed. A man's coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the wooden floor. No one noticed except Hazel, and the horrified eyes fixed on her as if she were a ghost. No one else in the cafe understood what she had said. But that man did. The pain in his gaze was unmistakable, like a knife slicing through memory. And then, the unspoken question filled his eyes. How could she possibly know that language?
Welcome to 30 Millionaire Stories, where success meets solitude, and every story heals a hidden wound. Subscribe and discover the heart behind the fortune.
Julian Rowe was accustomed to keeping his pain to himself. He was the kind of man who made others believe he could endure anything. In the photos gracing financial magazines, he always stood upright, his gaze icy, his facial features as hard and unyielding as steel. People called him the golden mind of the neural restoration field, a man who transformed blocks of metal into hope for patients who had lost the ability to speak, walk, or reach out to the world again. But no technology was sophisticated enough to heal the void in his heart after Isabel was gone. Isabel was everything Julian was not. She was vibrant, gentle, and never tried to hide her emotions. They met at an academic conference in New York, where Isabel presented on a fictional language as if narrating a real fairy tale. Julian was drawn not only to her beauty, but to something within her, a light in her soul that made time slow whenever she entered a room. Illyrian was the language she had devoted her entire doctoral thesis to reconstructing. A fictional tongue born from scattered passages in ancient fantasy novels, stitched together with modern linguistics and a near-desperate romance. But Isabel did more than reconstruct it as a scholar. She lived it, breathed it, and taught Julian each syllable as if it were the only key to fully understanding her. Illyrian had no word for goodbye, but it offered 7 different ways to say, "Please stay." Julian once thought that was excessive, until Isabel began her treatments. As her hair fell out in clumps, her fingers weakened, and the night stretched hollow with the hiss of ventilators, it was Illyrian that held them together. Each night, they whispered in that language like 2 souls standing before a storm, building a barricade of words only they could understand. It did not prolong Isabel's life, but it made her final days wholly lived, and then she slipped away. Not with a final sigh, but with eyes still open, as if gazing at something distant Julian could not see. Afterwards, their apartment fell into a cruel silence. Julian boxed every trace of Illyrian into a wooden chest and tucked it away in a drawer he never opened. He did not want to forget, yet lacked the courage to remember. Until this afternoon, when those words echoed through the warm air of an ordinary cafe, not from Isabel's lips, but from a stranger kneeling beside her trembling younger brother. When Julian heard the first phrase, "Yelin at Milla," he felt as though he'd been torn from the present. It was like a thin, sharp, frigid blade plunged into the softest part of him, the part he had spent so long hiding. No one else ever spoke those words. No one could know them. His hand shook, the coffee cup slipping from his grasp and shattering into hundreds of fragments, just like the way he felt inside. Yet around him, the world carried on, oblivious to the fact that his own world was collapsing for a second time. Who was that girl? And how could she know the language that had died with his wife? Was this mere coincidence? Or was something far greater returning to call him back from the place where he had buried his memories? Dear viewers, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit like, subscribe if you enjoy inspirational stories, and don't forget to comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you live? I always feel wonderful seeing the world come together just to share a meaningful moment. Julian Rowe was never one to strike up casual conversation. He had grown accustomed to silence, a kind of invisible language best understood by those who have endured loss. But that day, after picking up each shard of broken cup and returning to the counter, something in Hazel's eyes made him stay, rather than leave as just another stranger. It wasn't curiosity that held him there. It was fear. Fear that if he didn't ask, he would miss the last chance to reconnect with something he believed had died with the woman he once loved. They spoke for the first time when the cafe had emptied, the wind still howling against the windows. Hazel gave him a gentle, polite smile, maintaining her distance. Julian was cautious, as though each question might reopen an unhealed wound. When he asked about the words she had spoken, Hazel hesitated briefly. Then she told him in a tone not of display but of someone who guards memories as sacred relics that her mother, Lorraine Quinn, had been a linguistics lecturer. After giving birth first to Hazel, then to Leo, Lorraine abandoned everything to retreat into a small world of family. She would whisper strange words to Hazel as a child, especially on stormy nights or whenever Hazel was afraid. One of those words was Elena, meaning light returned. a meaning Hazel only fully grasped later, by feeling rather than by grammar. The name Lorraine Quinn stunned Julian. He had heard Isabel mention it many times in stories of their university days, late-night discussions at NYU, about a friend, a soulmate, the one who helped her give birth to the earliest chapters of Illyrian. Julian had never imagined that Lorraine was Hazel's mother. Nor had he imagined that he was standing before a piece of Isabel's story he had never known existed. That dizzying revelation nearly silenced him. Only Hazel's steady, compassionate gaze gave him courage, as if she understood he was traversing an unnamed memory. The next day, Hazel returned to the small apartment she shared with Leo. She opened her late mother's old wooden cabinet, the one she had never dared touch since Lorraine's death, out of fear that some sorrows, once unearthed, could not be easily restored. At the bottom of the cabinet lay a dusty yet unblemished box. Hazel lifted its lid with trembling hands. Inside were leather-bound notebooks, several old Polaroid photographs, and a bundle of letters tied with faded silver ribbon. The letters were addressed to Isabel, but bore no postage marks. Each letter was a fragment of Lorraine's soul, honest, wounded, loving, and laden with regret. Hazel read every line. Each word seemed to be whispered again by her mother across the blank spaces of time. Dear Isabel, I know I vanished without a word. I chose to be a mother and lost the only friend who truly understood me. I was too afraid to say goodbye, so I said nothing. Yet, Illyrian lives on. I still use it. I teach Hazel each word, each lullaby, believing that if I kept this language alive, I could preserve something of us. Hazel folded the letter, tears falling silently. Some relationships do not end in arguments or distance, but in silence. A silence so complete that each side believes the other has forgotten. But her mother never forgot. When Julian read those lines, he could not hold back his own tears. There was something profoundly human, fragile, and sacred in that confession. Illyrian was more than a system of words. It was the red thread binding two women who once dreamed of writing a book but never had the chance. And now, through unsent letters and a daughter who never knew, that book was writing itself anew. But why had Lorraine chosen silence? And could those long-cherished dreams be continued by a generation unaware that they carry a living legacy within their hearts? The Illyrian lessons began as a way to learn the language. But very quickly, both Julian and Hazel realized they were learning far more than vocabulary. It started with sessions sitting across from each other in a quiet cafe, Hazel writing each word on paper, explaining grammar, phonetic shifts, and the rules her mother had taught through little stories of jungles, starfields, and uncharted travelers. Julian took meticulous notes, but what he learned most wasn't in his notebook. It was in the way Hazel paused when recalling a word, her eyes lighting up as though she were summoning a distant memory. In those lessons, Hazel was no longer the cautious barista or the responsible big sister. She was a woman whose soul was unfolding, bit by bit. She told him about nights when her mother whispered Illyrian in her ear as she lay feverish, and how Lorraine used the word thiranel, meaning to hold with light, instead of saying, I love you. Details Hazel had long thought faded sprang back to life as vividly as if they'd never left. Julian began to laugh more. Not the polite chuckle of social courtesy, but genuine laughter that bubbled up when Hazel said something silly, or when she scrunched her face explaining that in Illyrian there was no word for sorry, only the phrase, I see your pain. Perhaps, Julian thought, forgiveness doesn't begin with remorse, but with understanding. Hazel realized she could be vulnerable without shame. She confided in Julian her sleepless nights, worried about Leo's tuition, and her fear of becoming the worst version of her mother if she couldn't keep everything afloat. Julian spoke little, but his gentle silence made her feel safe for the first time in years. Then one day, when their unnamed routine had settled in, they traveled together to the NYU library. Julian had special access thanks to Isabel's academic reputation, and he felt Hazel deserved to see where it all began. The long, dimly lit stacks, the scent of aging paper, they seemed to beckon them back to another era, when two women, Lorraine and Isabel, spent hours side by side crafting a language nobody else believed necessary. The librarian, an elderly man whose eyes looked as if they'd read every book in existence, led them into the archives. From a drawer labeled in faded print, Fantasy Languages, 92nd, Hazel pulled out a yellowed manuscript. Thin, handwritten pages, complete with phonetic charts, inflection tables, and margin notes in both Isabel's and Lorraine's hands, blue ink interwoven with purple, with flourishes next to decisive straight lines. The tentative title, The Language of Light. Hazel turned each page, her lips pressed together as if afraid a deep breath might tear the fragile record. Every word, every annotation bore the imprint of two souls who had lived for language. Then she reached a page crossed out in red with a hurried note below, "We'll rewrite this part later, okay?" Unsigned, unexplained. But Hazel knew that was her mother's voice, and that later had never come. She sat quietly for a long moment. Julian asked nothing. He remained beside her, as if even the air held its breath, afraid to disturb something sacred. Finally, Hazel whispered without looking at Julian, without hesitation, "We can write it ourselves." Julian turned to her. In that instant, he no longer saw Hazel as a stand-in for Isabel, but as a newly risen star kindled from the ashes of an old flame. He did not want to step back or compare anymore. This love was not a copy. It was the next chapter. Not explosive as first love, but deeper smoldering, rooted. A love that asks no one to forget the past, only the courage to love once more. But can the past truly rest when the present begins to pen a new chapter? Dear viewers, please relax for a moment or have a sip of water, then stay tuned for the next surprising developments. Comment 1 if you're enjoying the story, so we know you're still here. Isabel's anniversary arrived like a silent wave unannounced, undramatic yet powerful enough to sweep Julian back onto the shores of memories he thought had long since dried up. He did not light candles. He did not visit the cemetery. Instead, he chose to return to where everything began, NYU, and the room that held the most indelible trace of Isabel's life, the Special Archives for Linguistics. Julian entered that time-worn space with Hazel at his side, both of them like seekers in an unnamed museum. The walls were lined with stacked steel cabinets, each drawer filled with files, manuscripts, and fragments of languages once alive on human tongues before being lulled to sleep by time. The yellowed fluorescent lights glinted off metal surfaces, creating an atmosphere at once sacred and fragile, like a hushed prayer. Hazel did not know why Julian had brought her here, but she followed without question because some moments need no explanation, only presence. In that near-frozen silence, Julian placed his hand on a small wooden box. It held unpublished manuscripts, most forgotten or never completed. From within, he drew a weathered brown leather notebook, tied with a black ribbon. No title, no markings beyond the cover. He turned to look at Hazel. Her feet stayed planted. Not from surprise, but because something profoundly peaceful and real hovered in that quiet air. No flowers, no kneeling before a crowd. Just two people amidst dust-covered pages with the unmistakable sense that past and present stood side by side. Julian knelt, no ring in hand. His grasp on the notebook remained firm. His voice was low, steady, carrying the emotion of someone who has learned to love again after loss. "I cannot promise to make you forget the pain, but I promise to write something new with you, something more beautiful than what we have lost." Hazel said nothing. She took the notebook and opened it. The first page held a Polaroid photograph, its colors faded by time. Lorraine and Isabel, young and hopeful, seated together in a classroom. Below it, in pale blue ink and Illyrian script, was a single line. Love is not finite. It's fluent. Hazel's vision blurred. Not from sorrow, but because something in her heart, that which had frozen after her mother's death, that which had trembled the first time she soothed Leo in the old tongue, was now melting like snow in the first light of spring. She did not reply in English, nor did she need to consent in any conventional way. Hazel bowed her head and whispered, her voice almost dissolving into the air, as though sharing a secret meant for only the two of them in that archive of sleeping voices. Thare velinor. In Illyrian, yes, always. Julian smiled, not the smile of victory or conquest, but the smile of someone who had set down an old sorrow to open his arms to a new chapter, one that does not replace anyone, but continues what was left unfinished. Outside the window, the sky shifted to sunset. Amber light flooded the room, illuminating the old photograph. In that moment, the two women who had gone before seemed present with them, not in form, but in the will to carry on, in the language resurrected, in the love rewritten yet differently. But can love, no matter how gentle, hold them fast when the untouched memories still wait beyond the threshold? New York that day shone with sunlight after a week of relentless rain. Soft, velvety light poured through the glass dome of the New York Public Library, gilding the stone steps and giving the venerable building the air of a gentle smile. A steady queue formed outside, mostly students, scholars, and book lovers, not waiting for a famous author, but for a renowned title, The Language of Light, How Forgotten Words Heal the Soul. Behind that work stood Hazel Rowe, formerly Hazel Quinn. She was no longer the barista juggling shifts and scholarships, but a scholar, a storyteller, and the living bridge across 3 generations of women bound by a language known to no one else, Illyrian. The library's main reading room had been transformed into a signing venue. Beneath the soaring dome and among the ancient shelves, a simple wooden podium stood before a backdrop displaying the original manuscript's first page, a photograph of Lorraine and Isabel, with the Illyrian subtitle, Love is not finite, it's fluent. Hazel stood poised behind the podium, her hair neatly pinned, dressed in an ivory linen dress. The afternoon light through the windows seemed to make her glow. Yet what drew every eye was not her appearance, but her presence. Steady, gentle, imbued with something ancient yet intimate, like a melody once forgotten now resonating again in the collective memory. Julian sat in the front row, silent. In his arms lay Isla, their 2-year-old daughter, sleeping peacefully, her head resting on his chest, her tiny fingers gripping his pale blue shirt. Beside him stood Leo, now much taller and a junior studying computer engineering at MIT, yet with the same tender eyes he had as the boy who once wept over his mother's wooden bracelet. Hazel opened her talk not with discussion of her book, but with memory of 2 women, Lorraine and Isabel, who loved language as fiercely as life itself. She recounted how they thought silence had severed them, and how the words left unspoken eventually found their voice again through the next generation. She did not cry, though her voice faltered several times, not from stumbling, but from silence. A silence that let the audience feel the spaces in the story where words fail, empathy remains. Then, in a near whisper, she said, I used to believe loss was the final period, but then I learned loss is only a comma, followed by the next story if we have the courage to keep reading. The room held its breath and then erupted into applause, not merely for her courage, but because, in her words, everyone recognized themselves. Each had lost someone, Each had an unopened chapter. And perhaps now, it was time. Hazel offered a graceful nod of thanks. As cameras flashed and books were lined up for signatures, she glanced toward Julian. He stayed seated, smiling because he knew today was neither the final chapter nor the first. It was a bridge between the words never written and the stories now spoken in an ancient tongue by new hearts. Isla shifted in her sleep, her lips forming sounds no one could decipher, perhaps gentle breaths, perhaps fragments of an Illyrian lullaby she had heard nightly. But Julian understood. No translation was needed. Love in this family required no transcription. It flowed like a stream through memories, through loss, through all that remained unspoken. And here, in a city always rushing onward, within a library steeped in history, one family was writing its next chapter, not with promises, but with the life they were living. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about love is not holding someone forever, but having the courage to keep loving after loss. Hazel and Julian's story reminds us that loss is not the final period. It is part of the narrative, sometimes the opening chapter to something new, deeper, and more complete. True love knows no bounds of time, language, or form. It lives in small things. A whispered word, a shared glance, a memory only we understand, and, above all, in what we choose to carry on doing for those no longer by our side. Thank you for listening through to the very end. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment, share your own story, or tag someone who needs to hear this today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next stories where love, loss, and hope always find each other.